Good morning. I'm Pastor Jane Gingrich, serving Hills of Peace Lutheran Church here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
I'm Pastor John Boyd. I serve St. George's Anglican Parish here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
As a clergy couple, we regularly discuss a wide variety of topics under the sun, and weekly we record one of those conversations to share with you on Wednesday mornings, with the opportunity for a follow-up discussion on Thursday mornings. Our topic this week is, why do bad things happen to good people? So, John, why do bad things happen to good people?
I don't know. I think is actually a good answer. We don't fully have all of the reasons why, when we look at what happens day to day, some people suffer more than others or seem to suffer more than others, why there's tragedy, why there seems to be things going on in the world that are horrific to us and horrible and seem totally out of control, and we ask ourselves, why didn't God do something? Why didn't God directly intervene and stop that from happening? And in particular, this has been the question in many Christian circles around the entire COVID crisis. Why is God making us go through this? Is this punishment from God? Is this way how God is driving people back to the church and back to faith? And I think that even now, though we have the full revelation of God and God's intention in the crucified Jesus Christ, that more often than not, when we open Scripture and we hear the liturgy in our worship and in our prayer interpret the words written about Jesus Christ, we know that it usually is not until later, after events happen, and we look backwards in time, that we begin to see some glimpse of some pattern of where God was at work. But as St. Paul says to the church in Corinth, we see now in part, we know now in part, we don't have the full answer as to why. But I think having that half answer is part of what makes us so anxious, and what makes faith such a challenge to have sometimes, is it is difficult to have seemingly no answer or part of an answer. What do you think? Why do bad things happen to good people?
Well, I don't tend to think what I often hear, and that is that only bad things happen to bad people, right? That's what we all want to believe, that there is a reason for the awful things that happen, or that when we hear of something terrible, that, well, there's a reason that happened to that person. The problem is when we come to children who are born with different capacities, or when an accident with vehicles or otherwise causes a person to be incapacitated, or when someone dies at a young age. God does not want for the brokenness of the world to exist as it does, in the way that I understand our loving Creator. And yet, the world is full of brokenness. There are so many ways that we behave destructively, intentionally and unintentionally, and that destruction extends beyond ourselves. And the very fact that we are enfleshed in these bodies that are incomplete and breakable and fallible means that we are going to run into times of brokenness, and that bad things will happen. That doesn't mean that bad things only happen to bad people. There are plenty of beloved, faithful, caring, kind, hardworking people to whom awful experiences come in this life. But God does not abandon them, and God does not abandon any of us in our times of suffering, struggle, pain, illness, hurt, loneliness, loss, confusion. God is always with us. And so why do bad things happen to good people? Because we live in a world that is incomplete, that is broken, that has so many pieces to it that some come apart and some move towards destruction. And unfortunately, that means that regularly we experience pain. At the same time, God continues to dwell with us and to break through even the most awful suffering and make use of the challenges and pain in life to purposes that we can't even imagine. And so often, as you say, it is only in reflecting afterwards that we can see how God was present with us through a time of suffering, or how it was God that guided us through or brought us what we needed or offered us support in the presence of another person that got us through a time of difficulty. And so, while it would seem maybe easier to think that our actions are the cause of every experience within our lives, it's not true. For us to believe that something like sinful behavior is then the cause of suffering as a guaranteed outcome is not accurate to human experience in this world. We know that people get away with very bad behavior, and we also know that people who are doing their very best and striving for what they understand to be the will of God are experiencing suffering. And so bad things happen to good people because this world is as it is, and while God is present with us here within it, God has given us so much opportunity that we have impacted the world in ways that lead towards brokenness variously. Are there any examples that you would like to talk about or stories you'd like to share?
You have a very good example, one of the most poignant ones that I think a lot of us go to, which is the suffering of a child or the death of an innocent person. And we see that reflected in the death of Jesus as well, which is why I think it's important to continue to emphasize that when we look at Jesus Christ crucified for our sake and risen for us, we do have glimpses that give us a place to begin our hope and our prayer while working and living through these things. But yes, it doesn't give us a full answer as to why. There are numerous examples. I do think that you brought up the topic of sin as a really excellent thing to remember, is that in the midst of our own suffering, it's very hard, I think, to retain a universal perspective when suffering is so personal and so acute for us. But as we move through the grieving process, one of the things that I look for and one of the things that I hope for people who I'm walking with is that they begin to step further and further back and begin to see the way in which that God has chosen to work equally for everyone, that all of us fall under the umbrella of sin and being sinners, and that part of the mystery of God's love is allowing people who are sinners to have agency and to do things. And that's where we realize how interconnected all of our lives are, and how somebody else's sin does come through time and history and affect me personally. There's that biblical line, I am a jealous God visiting the sins of one generation upon the fifth and the seventh. We shouldn't hear that as, a wrathful, angry God that just enjoys punishing people forever and ever. But what God is saying is, look, if somebody's doing this over here and I love them equally and I'm working with them, that is going to affect the entire community, which is why for the Israelites, understanding sin it was important to understand sin as a corporate issue. Yes, individuals were doing it, but it affected the entire community. And that's one of the things that I think we are brought to awareness of every Sunday when we make our confession of sin, is that our sin is corporate. We've affected each other. And occasionally that ends up meaning that bad things do happen to good or innocent people when we least intend it. We have no idea of how we affect each other. And that goes to even innocent things, like environmental solutions, where we think we've come up with something that's going to be life-giving and caretaking as a solution to a human-created problem. And the solution we come up with works for a time, and then we learn about all of these side effects, and these side effects end up affecting children, affecting other people. So the interconnectedness of life, as we've been talking about, I think is just so vast that we cannot escape being affected by stuff that's going around the world constantly. And that is where I think you're absolutely speaking to that by saying that God continuously breaks in. And I think that's a very important thing for us to realize, is that we are constantly praying. So there's this thing that's out of our control. God, come to us, deliver us from this, bring this to an end in a way that's best for everybody. Yeah, I don't necessarily have specific personal examples that come to mind of that, but I do see in pastoral care how that's connected the way that you've been saying. Do you have personal stories and examples that come immediately to mind around it?
Well, I don't think it's appropriate to share in a video experiences of pastoral care through a whole variety of situations that people are struggling with. But what I would say is, when we are in suffering and wondering and still come to that question of why, as we naturally do as humans, one of the best things to do is to pray.
Yeah.
That even though we still struggle through suffering and pain and wonder why, even when we can acknowledge that we are incomplete, this world is incomplete, so much is broken in what is going on around us, we have impacted each other even generationally and to the third and fourth generation, there is still a call and invitation from God to pray. And so when we are wondering or worrying or hurting, that it is important for us to share what is going on with God and to recognize that through prayer, God hears us, and that while God is present with us always, to share that voice with God sometimes has an effect of drawing a nearness or a sense of God's presence to us again. That it's not unusual to forget at times as well. And so I think there's a lot more to unpack, and maybe we'll hear some more stories tomorrow and be able to share some more thoughts there. But I would like to thank you for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow, Thursday morning, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. on Zoom. The link has been shared with you by email or can be found on Hills of Peace Lutheran Facebook page. See you tomorrow.